Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. We're here to learn from Alex Smith, a former fellow in congressional policymaking in residence here at the Kluge Center in the summers of 2022 and 2023. He's currently a lecturer in the political science department at the University of Iowa. He's previously faculty at Oklahoma State University and was a legislative staffer for 5 years before earning his PhD in political science at the University of Florida, working in the district office for Congressman Peter Roskam of Illinois, for the Ways and Means Committee at the Minnesota House of Representatives. And it's that practical experience in political negotiation, watching politics happen, that inspired Alex's research. I'm excited to be able to dive into this with you, Alex, and learn about political negotiation, how things can get done in political legislative bodies. The title of your talk, skipping to the subtitle, suggests that we might have some terms to define.
Sure.
And so I want to dive in a bit and ask you to tell us a little bit about heraesthetic, the ways in which you're thinking about political negotiation.
Sure. So you can see the title here, the subtitle with this word heraesthetic. Heraesthetic sounds like a scary word. And a lot of times when I mention this to people, they sort of roll their eyes and they tune out. So I want to define what this is because it really doesn't need to be a scary term. And some of the ways that it gets introduced can help us understand political negotiation. So heraesthetic is a concept that William Riker, a political scientist, came up with in the 1980s. And he describes heraesthetic as the art of political manipulation. And so he sort of describes it as a set of political strategies that you can use in any type of decision-making environment, and you use these strategies so that you can win, so that you can get an outcome that you like. And he says that these strategies allow you to win because what you're doing is you're putting people in situations where they want to join you or they feel like they have to join you. So sometimes when I teach this to my students, we talk about, you might think of it, Riker often thinks of heraesthetic as sort of the Godfather. You're going to make them an offer they can't refuse.
You use the word manipulation, and that sounds somewhat firm.
Right, and so that is sort of the focus that Riker takes on it, but there's another part here in sort of the preface to this book, The Art of Political Manipulation, where Riker talks about how what heraesthetic is really about is the strategy value of sentences. So the strategic element that allows you to get people to do what they otherwise might not do. And so I'm taking a slightly different approach to say that heraesthetic isn't necessarily about forcing someone into a situation. It's not about doing it once and then it works and that's how you get what you want. It's about using strategies that are going to allow you to pursue an outcome that you can live with. Even if it's not your most preferred outcome, it's better than what you think is going to happen, and that would result in you losing. So if you think that if you are thinking that you're about to lose, then you start to use these strategies to try and pursue a next best option, even if you can't get your preferred favorite. So we have different types of heraesthetic strategies that he uses here.
Before you skip into that,
Sure.
I had framed this, and as did you, with the presentation on legislative bodies, but this applies in other contexts, it sounds like.
Yes, so Riker even has a chapter where he talks about it being used in a fictional setting, and he's looking at a college department that they've lost their master. It's in Britain, so it's called master instead of department chair or department head. And so he looks at how heraesthetic gets used to decide who the next master of that department is going to be. So it's something you can use if you're trying to figure out where you want to go to lunch with your friends. If there's at least 3 people there, you can start using some of these strategies to get an outcome that you like. And so it's not confined to legislative settings, but that's sort of the situation where we think of them being used most commonly.
And here are some of the tactics.
Yep, so here are our tactics, and Riker identifies 3, agenda control, strategic voting, and dimension manipulation. And then you can see a 4th one up there called participant curation, and this is one that me and 2 of my co-authors identified when we were studying the Constitutional Convention. So with Stephen Phillips and Peter Licari, we discovered this one called participant curation. So let me just briefly walk through what each of these entails. And what we're most interested for our talk today is going to be strategic voting and dimension manipulation. But let's start with agenda control. So agenda control is about setting up the order of debate in a way that privileges the outcomes that you want. So if you set things up, particularly in an order where it's this or that, yes or no on a vote, you can arrange things and sort of map out a path for winning many times. And Riker says this works because often tastes are cyclical. Agenda control is probably the most studied of these tactics in political science.
It sounds like Congress 101 too.
Yes, yes.
It's what Congress does.
And so agenda control is often something that we're going to see legislative leaders use. So the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, committee chairs, and people in those types of positions are going to use that. And then we have strategic voting. And this is one that I really find interesting because what you do here when you see strategic voting is someone votes against their true preference, their true taste, what it is that they really want, in part because they think it's likely to lose. So they decide then the best course of action is to pursue a next best option. And so one way we see this is through vote trading. Vote trading is a subtype of strategic voting. It's not the only type of strategic voting, but vote trading is sort of the one that we don't like, the quid pro quo, where you say, if you vote for this, if I put this in the bill, then you'll vote for it. Or if I vote for this bill, then you need to help me with fundraising for my campaign, or you need to give me a hearing in this other committee, or something like that. Yeah. This is the one we're very uncomfortable with when we see it, and it's very blatant and very open. And so often, people don't like to admit to vote trading for obvious reasons.
Are there less pernicious versions of this?
Sure, there are ways where you might say, well, this is an issue where I don't really care about it. It's not that important to my constituents. And so what we might do is say, I'm kind of ambivalent. My constituents are ambivalent. I'm inclined to vote no, but I really don't care. And my constituents aren't going to punish me if I vote for it. So what I'll do is I'll vote for this thing you want, and then we sort of exchange votes on something else where you're ambivalent and something like that.
Dimension manipulation seems a little more complicated.
Dimension manipulation can be a bit complicated. So often what we're seeing here is we're introducing new information, we're redefining issues, we're trying to formulate a new understanding of a concept and think about it in a new way. And that can introduce new information, a new perspective that then is hard to ignore. And so Riker says this one works because sometimes you interpret something in a different way, and once people hear it, they can't unhear it. And so they can't get rid of that information in their head.
Let me preview for everyone else that we're going to walk through some examples, some historical examples, not just the Affordable Care Act, but some ones from earlier centuries as well. Can you give us a snapshot, an example of this kind of work, or do you want to wait till we get to those historical examples? And that is reframing how people perceive something.
Sure. So at the Constitutional Convention, one of the things that happens is they're arguing about, well, how many people is each state going to have in the House of Representatives, and how many people are they going to have in the Senate? And many of the states want proportional representation in both chambers. And so this would allow some of the states that have larger populations to have more voting members in both the House and the Senate, and presumably more power in both chambers of Congress, and more authority over decision-making in the new, stronger national government that can do a lot of things that the Articles of Convention or Articles of Confederation couldn't do.
Virginia loved this idea.
Correct. And so one of the ways we see dimension manipulation is when this delegate from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, says, we need to start thinking about the interests of the states as states. And some of these smaller states are opposed to this, but then there's also a few states where they have a large amount of territory, but they don't have large populations yet. So they think, well, if we keep expanding into the western part of our territory, we'll become one of those big states like Virginia. Right. And then in the long run, we'll have more control. But in the short run, what Sherman does is by tying this to states' rights, he's saying, do you really want South Carolina, do you really want Massachusetts and Pennsylvania to be able to dictate what your state can do?
Right.
and what the national laws are, given this expanded scope of powers that the national government's going to have. So by tying it to states' rights, he sort of redefines the issue, and some of those particularly southern states have to rethink how they feel about proportional representation in both chambers and perhaps ceding too much of their state authority to the national government.
Great. Okay, I stopped you. So
Yep.
keep us on dimension manipulation and its other elements.
Sure. So there's two types of dimension manipulation, and they're kind of polar opposites. So one is increasing dimensionality, which is where you introduce a new way of understanding this topic. So you're trying to tie in some new element. We'll talk about this more when we get to the Affordable Care Act, but we see this happen when in the sidecar bill, the reconciliation bill, the student loan reform gets worked into the sidecar bill, which is supposed to be about reforming the healthcare system. And now we get student loan reform. And the reason that we see increasing dimensionality there is because with the cost savings, it becomes a way to reduce the overall cost of the bill. And for some of the more moderate, conservative, fiscal conservative Democrats, the blue dogs, that makes it easier to vote for this bill because it's not going to add quite as much to the federal deficit.
Got it.
So we see a new area introduced there, and it makes it easier for some people to vote for it. Now, the flip side of increasing dimensionality is fixing dimensionality, which is where you prevent increasing dimensionality from happening. So where you sort of say, these are the boundaries. We can't go beyond this. This is what we are focused on. So again, with the Affordable Care Act, we're actually going to see some of this happen outside of Congress. We're going to see President Obama start talking to some interest groups from the healthcare industry, and they're going to focus on increasing access to health insurance, and that's going to come sort of at the cost savings to individual consumers. So those are some examples that we'll see of increasing dimensionality and fixing dimensionality.
Great.
And then our fourth type here, participant curation, is one that we see in the Constitutional Convention with the creation of the Jerry Committee, which is meant to help resolve this issue, this debate over, are we going to have proportional representation in the Senate or equal representation of the states? So what they do is they're tied. They can't make an agreement with all of the state delegations voting. And so they create this committee. They appoint one person from each state, and they send them off, and they say, you come back to us with a recommendation. And so they come back with a recommendation, and it's basically what we know as the Connecticut Compromise is what they come back with, and they're able to get an endorsement for a certain perspective, do a little bit of vote trading in there as well, and
it never would have come
and
to
then
be
they move.
if it had remained in the
Right. That allows them to move forward by changing the location of the debate.
Yep.
And in that instance, they're narrowing down who's involved. Instead of having 50-something delegates, you've got 12. Actually, you've got 11.
Yeah.
Because New Hampshire's not there yet. So you have 11 delegates on that committee, and they're able to come back with a recommendation.
Before we dive into some of these historical examples, and we've already touched on 1787 and the Affordable Care Act, there's something more that we wanted to discuss here on legislative inertia. Give us a sense of what this is. I think the terms speak for themselves, a legislature that can't find a way to move forward on a particular issue. But can you help us put it in this context?
Sure. So the research project that I was working on here as a fellow in congressional policymaking is answering this question of how does Congress overcome long-term stalemate? When there has been a long period of time where they can't act on a particular issue and it's something that's on the national agenda, why can't they do it? And then all of a sudden you get something like the Affordable Care Act. After 100 years of various presidents from both parties trying to get national health care reform passed, why does it work for Barack Obama in 2010 instead of Bill Clinton in the 1990s or FDR during the second New Deal? And so this is sort of the question that I've been setting out to answer is, how do you take a policy topic that's at rest and put it into motion because typically this is where we see the biggest divisions, the most divisiveness in our political system over things like slavery in the 1850s. And so what I've found is that to try and take initial action, we're going to get a legitimacy crisis or multiple crises, which is sort of showing us that we need to act. It's putting pressure on the government to act. Otherwise, we as citizens start to question whether our political institutions are working for us, particularly the Congress. And if the Congress can't work, if they can't pass legislation to address some of these more complicated issues, then what good is that system? Yeah. So it increases pressure on members of Congress to start acting. And then once you get that, you need a strategy. You need a way to actually overcome these divisions, to get legislation through the House, through the Senate, and get the president to sign it instead of veto it. And what I'm finding in these case studies that I'm looking at is that we get these legitimacy crises, and then in the instances where we get legislative action, where we actually see legislative inertia change, we see multiple instances of dimension manipulation and strategic voting. And you might see some other things in there too, but those are the two consistents that I'm finding across all my cases.
And you said multiple instances.
Multiple instances.
It's a one and done kind of transformative moment in the debate.
Right. So this goes back to some of Riker's theory, where if you read through Riker's book, he's looking at sort of hair aesthetic as, well, it works once and then it's done. And what I'm finding is it's not just I'm manipulating you and tricking you. I'm finding ways to try and break down the divisions, the barriers that are keeping things from happening. But there are different people with different interests and different pressures, and they'll respond to different types of different pressures and strategies. And that's how you go about formulating what I call a disequilibrium, where you sort of break down the barriers that keep action from happening. And so we see dimension manipulation, we see strategic voting. We might see some other things in there too. We're going to see a lot of just chance and perhaps luck, where a president dies and then you get a vice president who takes over, and they're more willing to do things that the president wasn't willing to do.
So are we ready to start talking about some historical examples in detail? The Affordable Care Act, 2010. So I think we've already, first of all, we all remember this, but also we've been touching on this a bit. But can you set the stage just a bit?
Sure. So in the Affordable Care Act, we've had presidents beginning with Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 when he's running his third-party campaign, trying to get national health care reform passed, and it never works. They're never able to get it done. And so we see FDR try. We see Lyndon Johnson talk about it. We're going to see Richard Nixon. Bill Clinton tries in the 1990s, and that fails. And so when Barack Obama becomes president, and we're looking at the 2008 presidential election, even before he gets elected, we're seeing lots of different presidential candidates talking about this issue of health care. And there's a few reasons for that. We are getting some legitimacy crises that Congress and presidents feel like they need to respond to. So one of those is the Great Recession, which is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have access to health insurance at that point, primarily tied to people's employment status. And so as people are losing their jobs and unemployment's increasing, fewer people are enrolled in healthcare. And this is significant because the largest single sector of the economy at the time is the healthcare industry. It makes up about 16% of the economy. It also matters because when we start to look at US in a comparative context, we see that our healthcare costs as citizens are often about 50% higher than those of people in other industrialized Western nations. So we start looking at this and we start saying, why are our costs so much higher? Why is enrollment in health insurance dropping? We are in the greatest economic crisis where people are losing their jobs. And so we need to make sure that basic needs are met, becomes sort of the argument that we hear from candidates. We also have sort of this crisis within the healthcare industry where when we look at insurance premiums from 2000 until 2008, those insurance premiums that citizens are paying double. And wage growth during that time is 20%. So it's growing. Insurance premiums are growing at 5 times the rate of wage growth. So people are choosing, well, even if I'm keeping my job, I'm fairly healthy, I don't want to enroll in this because it's very expensive. And no one forces me to enroll in healthcare coverage. So I don't want to do that. And then the health insurance companies start saying, well, we're going to charge higher premiums because we have to cover the costs of the people that are enrolled. And all of this is, well, we're not covering pre-existing conditions, which is a big problem because then the insurance companies can start denying coverage to people based on long-term conditions that they've had before. So in 2008, we have 45 million Americans without health insurance. And presidential candidates, Congress, the health insurance industry, the healthcare industry, they all start saying something has to change here because we're in a bad situation.
Are you going to bring us onto the floor of Congress now at this point?
Sure.
So,
Sure.
I'm curious, because you've been talking a lot about pressures out there, real world pressures, but also there are some politically entrenched positions as well as powerful lobbyists that are involved in this. So how do we, what begins to happen on the floor of Congress, and where does Harris-Thetic come in?
Well, some of the interesting stuff that we see is in Harris-Thetic and that I didn't find as much in my other case studies is we start to see it extending outside the halls of Congress, and we see the president doing it and the way that he starts negotiating with healthcare interest groups. And so it sort of starts with the president trying to get some stakeholder buy-in by talking with AHIP and pharma and getting them on board with the idea of reforming the healthcare industry. And so we see some strategic voting where President Obama approaches them and he says, we're going to work out some basics, then Congress is going to work out more details. And so there's this sort of agreement that gets made where what we're going to do is we are going to focus on covering pre-existing conditions, or we need to cover pre-existing conditions. This is something that both political parties want. It's going to cost the insurance companies a lot of money. So what the insurance companies and AHIP say is, well, if we're going to cover pre-existing conditions, if that's going to be included in the bill, then we need an individual mandate, which is going to require that Americans be enrolled in healthcare and be paying premiums, because that's the only way to try to keep those more reasonable. So we actually have that sort of example before we get to the negotiations in Congress. And then in Congress, we see a lot of strategic voting as well. So we're going to see some House Democrats working with Speaker Pelosi, actually asking for things that are unrelated to healthcare. They're going to say, well, I can vote for the bill. We know it's going to be unpopular. What I need is support from a leadership fundraising campaign to help me fight off a primary challenger. If someone decides to run against me in the Democratic primary, I need the party's support if I'm going to vote for this bill. And we see other Democrats say, well, in my state of California, irrigation's a very big problem. Water's a very big problem. We need some funding to improve irrigation and water access in California, and if I get that, then I can vote for the health care bill.
So forgive me, but this is dimension manipulation, right?
No.
They're adding issues to the table?
Sort of, but it's also sort of strategic voting, because what they're doing is they're taking some issues that are unconnected and they're trying to trade on them and say, you can get my vote for this if you give me that. And so that is where we see a little bit of strategic voting. We're also going to see it later on in the process when the House has passed its bill and the Senate is debating their bill, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is going to say, here's how we're going to pass our bill. I'm going to offer something called a manager's amendment. And if you ask for something and it gets put in that manager's amendment, you have to vote for it, and then you have to vote for the bill. So it's sort of this agreement that I'll make this concession to you, I'll include that, but then you have to agree to vote for not only that, but what your colleagues have asked for.
Got it.
So this is how we get things like we get a reduction, the payroll device, the medical device tax, which is something that a few senators ask for because they have medical industry in their states. And so they don't want to see that tax going up. We get something that gets referred to as the Louisiana Purchase. which is perhaps maybe the most clear example that we're going to see of potential vote trading here, which is where one of the senators from Louisiana asks for $100 million in Medicaid subsidies that's only for the state of Louisiana. So they write this section that says, they include some language that says, if you meet these conditions, then you get $100 million to offset Medicaid costs. Well, the only state that meets the conditions is Louisiana. It's sort of written that way. Another example is we get something called the Cornhusker Kickback, which is $100 million in permanent funding for the state of Nebraska that one of the Nebraska senators asks for. So these are all these things that are being used in these negotiations to try and get certain legislators on board after they have been threatening to hold out.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is, if I put that in for you, you're going to vote for it. So these are things that happen. A lot of those things that I just mentioned in the manager's amendment, eventually they get taken out. They don't make it into the final version that becomes law. But to get that initial bill through the Senate, that's sort of what they have to do.
Yeah.
And we will see later on, we get almost another example. We get the Stupak Amendment in October of 2009, which it helps in the House to get support from some of the pro-life Democrats, and convinces them it's going to restrict funding from the federal government from being used for abortions in these exchange programs. And then when the Senate bill and the sidecar move forward, we're going to see that there's not a way to include that in the sidecar bill, and it wasn't originally included in the Senate bill. So what they do is they get President Obama to agree to issue an executive order that will essentially do the same thing as the Stupak Amendment did in the House version of the bill. And then they get an endorsement, they get the approval of Catholic nuns, the Catholic Health Association, and that matters for the pro-life Democrats who can then say, we're not funding abortion, now we can vote for this bill.
So we're diving into this in detail. There's some other historical examples I want to come to. Conclusions on this, and then we'll in open Q&A we can come back to the ACA, obviously.
Sure. So let me just mention a little on dimension manipulation here that we see. So we are going to see that the House passes a bill in early November of 2009 where they want to create, it includes something called the public option, and they are going to allow for the national government to run the insurance market. So we're going to have this national insurance program. Well, in the Senate, they're having a harder time getting the Senate on board with that, the senators on board with that. And so they are going to introduce the topic of federalism here by saying we're not going to allow for this national government takeover of health care to occur, which is the way it's being argued against in the public. Instead, we're going to allow the state governments to operate their own exchanges, their own state-level marketplaces for the insurance companies that can be sold in within their borders. So we get an example of increasing dimensionality there by introducing the topic of federalism.
Yeah.
And the last one that I want to mention is one that I briefly mentioned before, which is we get the introduction of student loan reform into the final version of the reconciliation bill. The reconciliation bill becomes sort of the House's vote trade that they get from the Senate, because once the Senate supermajority is lost with the special election in Massachusetts of Scott Brown, then the Republicans can filibuster any agreement, any new compromise plan that the House and Senate come up with. So they go with this controversial strategy called budget reconciliation, which can't be filibustered, but they have to accept the Senate outline of the bill. And the more progressive House members don't want to do that, so they're able to work in some reforms to the way the student loan system works in America, and that's going to bring in some long-term cost savings and reduce the overall cost of the bill, which helps some of the more fiscally conservative Democrats vote for it.
Yeah.
And so then we barely get this bill getting across the finish line.
And this is the moment.
This is the moment that we see the vote on the reconciliation bill in the House. So they first had to vote on the Senate bill, and then they vote on the reconciliation bill, and then the Senate has to approve it as well, and the Senate doesn't need a filibuster, or can't filibuster, so you don't have to keep the Senate Democrats united, and you also don't have to win over a Republican at that point.
So as a political scientist, you're able to draw from these historical case studies, essentially, enough material by which to sort of theorize what exactly is happening here. Let's as quickly as we can, hit the other centuries in American history, 18th, 19th, and 20th. The 18th is fascinating. We've already touched on it a bit, so maybe we don't have to spend much time here. But there's a reason that this is often called the miracle of Philadelphia. James Madison even calls it a miracle, and when he first shares the Constitution with Jefferson, it's impossible really to imagine a scenario where something like this could happen twice because it was such a unique confluence of things. Tell us what happened in Philadelphia.
So
Don't tell us everything that happened.
Right. So in
Tell us something
Philadelphia, the issue is the Articles of Confederation, the initial government that we are operating under at the national level, aren't working. They have no power. So we have to come together. We get Shays' Rebellion. We get the fear that some of these states might break off and actually try to operate independently. They might form confederacies of 3 or 4 states, but they're having a hard time working together. So they come together in Philadelphia, and the biggest thing they have to resolve is, if we're going to increase the powers of the national government, get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and start actually coming up with some new government, how are we going to decide how representation works in both chambers? And there's this division between the large states, the small states, and we get the Connecticut Compromise. We get the creation of that Jerry committee with that participant curation that I mentioned earlier. The people that get appointed to that committee, they're the people from those states that are most open to the idea of compromise on this issue. And it's not the people that are the hardliners like James Madison, who has presented the Virginia plan. He's the one who's most outspoken against the compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. He doesn't get a seat on that committee. And through a little bit of trickery, Roger Sherman of Connecticut gets on it. Initially, one of the other Connecticut delegates is supposed to be on there. On the day that this committee is supposed to meet, that delegate, Oliver Ellsworth, says, "I'm sick, I can't go." And so Roger Sherman goes, and you get the person who's been pushing for compromise and for equal representation of the states in the Senate actually in that committee bending people's ears. He works with Benjamin Franklin. We get the origination clause, a little bit of a vote trade there, where any bill that is going to affect revenues has to originate in the House of Representatives. And so the large states, most of them can live with that. If that's sort of a vote trade, we're going to give you that equal representation in the Senate, but we get more voting members in the chamber that's going to control the nation's purse strings. And so that's sort of a very quick overview of what we see in
so much happened there. It was a hot summer, and I would love to talk more about it. But let's go to another crisis point. And in some ways, by the way, both 1787 and the 1850s are often described in the context of a critical period in American history, where things are clearly headed towards potential disaster, but the status quo seems somewhat potentially anyway maintainable, and they're trying to find a way to solve problems, but disaster is looming. 1850 obviously is, as we know in hindsight, a decade before the Civil War. This is an attempt to try to salvage things before they go off the rails. Set the scene here.
Oh, this one's hard to do briefly. I taught this to my students last week, and it took 50 minutes to just do the context. So there's all these different things that are coming in terms of legitimacy crises. We have this balance rule that was set up in the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that allows it so that neither the North nor the South ever gets an advantage in the Senate. Again, that matters because there's an equal representation of states in the Senate. So if neither state gets an advantage in the Senate, so that there's more free states or more slave states, then you can't abolish slavery. It's sort of this agreement. Well, then we get this expansion west, and we get the addition of Texas, the annexation of Texas. We get the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession, and a lot of the southwest and northwest United States that we now have is acquired during that time. And they're trying to decide, is slavery going to be legal there or not? We get the California Gold Rush of 1849, and the people in California need to become a state because the military government that's there can't protect personal property rights as all these people are expanding, going out there, searching for gold, and it's the Wild West. I mean, it really is the Wild West. And so they're fighting, and it's so far away, it's on the opposite end of the country, they have to intervene. We get personal liberty laws, which are making the enforcement of the fugitive slave clause and fugitive slave laws very difficult in the North, and that's upsetting the South, and the southern states and people in the South are feeling like their constitutional rights are being denied to them. And we also have this tension. The greatest threat at that time to civil war was this dispute between over the border of Texas and New Mexico. New Mexico is a territory at the time. The border of Texas had been disputed for the past 15 years, and now that it's American territory, the Texans want to claim as much of it as they possibly can.
You've done a good job.
Yeah.
The
So-
1840s, 1850s are complicated.
So they have to figure all this stuff out, and the way they try to do it, the first go is this omnibus bill that Henry Clay starts writing, where he tries to tie all these different issues together into one bill. And so the term omnibus comes from this debate over the Compromise of 1850. And we're going to see vote trades and dimension manipulation here between connecting all these different topics, trying to connect the idea of settling this Texas-New Mexico border dispute where the Texans are threatening to go in. President Zachary Taylor is threatening to lead the United States Army himself to defend Santa Fe from Texas. We're going to see them have to work through this.
And Henry Clay, by the way, at this point has been one of the most influential people in Washington, D.C. for more than 4 decades. I mean, he's an astonishingly powerful person. And he seems as if he's got a plan here.
So his plan is this vote trade to get the Texas senators on board. And so the vote trade is going to be, we're going to keep the border so that Texas doesn't necessarily get the border they want. Well, they go against that. They try to create this commission that's going to settle it and also dissolve the military government that exists in Santa Fe at the time. And they're also going to pay off Texas's state debts that had been accumulated before it became a state. And now that they're a state and there's more revenue sharing and stuff, they're not independent, they can't pay off their debt independently. So there's concessions that are going to be made to the 2 senators from Texas to get this bill through the Senate. But in doing so, Clay's plan backfires, and he loses the support of a senator from Missouri who makes a motion to get rid of the Texas-New Mexico language. Some other people figure out we can do some very clever procedural stuff, and they start deleting stuff out of the omnibus bill, and they take away every incentive to vote strategically for it.
Got it.
And so all those vote trades fall apart. And then we get the Compromise of 1850 after that. We actually have Henry Clay here on this image, but the Compromise of 1850 that we think of is largely then the work of Stephen Douglas, who comes in after Clay's omnibus bill has been stripped apart, and he starts passing these things independently of each other. He assembles the mini omnibus bill in the House of Representatives, a little bit of vote trading there to tie a few things back together. But they do this to start working through some of these issues. And we could spend a lot more time on it, but I know we're probably starting to run short on time.
But by breaking things down, they're changing some of the terms of the debate and allowing for different kinds of strategic voting and vote trading than had been possible before.
One of the interesting, just before we go on, one of the interesting examples of strategic voting we're going to see here is they do roll call votes on every single element of the Compromise of 1850, except for the fugitive slave law, the new fugitive slave law that they passed. They don't do a roll call vote in the Senate. A lot of the northern senators are gone for that vote. They don't want to go on the record as opposing the South. They can't go on the record as voting yes for it. And so we get what we might call some strategic non-voting, where they just happen to be absent at the time that vote is taken.
One more historical example, and then I want to go to questions to try to start to bring all this together. We're going to go a century forward, and in some ways a legacy of what the Compromise of 1850 didn't prevent, the Civil War, with the beginnings of an attempt to rebuild the kinds of civil rights that had been attempted immediately after the Civil War in the 1860s. So tell us about the Civil Rights Act of 1957 as briefly as you can.
Sure. So with here, we all know some of the or many of us are familiar with the beginnings of the civil rights movement. It's been, in 1957, it's been 82 years since Congress has passed the Civil Rights Bill, since 1875. So we really see that Congress is stuck. They can't pass an anti-lynching bill. They can't do anything. They can't protect voting rights. And so they're seeing pressure from the civil rights movement. We're seeing the murder of Emmett Till and then the acquittal of the people accused of his murder.
That's right. I happen to remember Martin Luther King as the Time Man of the Year in 1957. So it's a moment where the civil rights movement is really beginning to turn.
And one of the things here that is also worth noting is we're seeing external pressure from the outside, from foreign relations, where we're in the Cold War, and we're trying to stick with our policy of containment and not allowing communism to expand to other nations, and we're saying we're morally superior to this. Well, then the Soviet Union starts coming back when we're trying to prevent the expansion of communism into Asia and Africa and Central and South America, and they're putting up images from civil rights protests and saying, is this what you want? You're saying you're morally superior. Why is this happening? And so we're getting all this pressure. And so we get President Eisenhower running on civil rights in 1956. His civil rights bill passes the House in 1956 and then doesn't get a hearing in the Senate. In 1957, what we're going to see is Eisenhower introduces the same bill, and it seems like, based on his electoral support in 1956, the Republican Party is willing to go along with him on this bill. And so Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, who's a Democrat from the South, from Texas, comes in and says to his fellow Southerners, if you don't work with me on this, they're going to go ahead and pass this, and they're going to expand their voting coalition for the next half century. Democrats aren't going to be able to get elected, and what we need to do is we need to show that we can act on this issue. We need to protect the right to vote, and we need to limit the bill to that. And so that sort of becomes the Democratic Party strategy then, is he convinces the Southerners that they can filibuster on this bill if they need to, if they're uncomfortable with the directions that it's going, but they start to delete some of the sections that would have really empowered the national government to make stronger advancements in protecting civil rights. And so we're going to see a little bit of fixing dimensionality. We're going to see increasing dimensionality when they say, well, we're going to add this new part to the bill where it's going to allow African Americans in the South to serve on juries in federal courts for the first time. So now they can actually help us to rule in these cases where black civil rights are being denied. And so that becomes something that people from the West, the Northwest, can vote for, and they can go back and sell to their constituents and say, well, I voted to expand civil rights. We created a new civil right, the right to serve on a jury in the South, and that's something we can vote for. And Johnson sort of knew that. And so there's a few other things, but I know we're running out of time.
This is perfect. I know that there's one more slide where you were able to bring a few things together, and why don't we go have this up? You notice too here some of the long-term outcomes of things like the Civil Rights Act of 1957 included it having set laid the groundwork for future expansions on those same issues. As we go to questions, and I'm eager to take questions from the audience. There are microphones so that people online can hear you as well, or questions from online. You want to have a couple of minutes just to sum up a couple of takeaways and
Sure.
we'll go to our first question?
Yeah, let me just run through this real quick. So as we've been talking about, what I'm finding in these different cases is that we're getting multiple instances of strategic voting and dimension manipulation after we get a legitimacy crisis. And that's providing the sort of opportunities to apply more force and change legislative inertia to get something to pass. Now, what we see through the use of these strategies also becomes important. And what we see is that they are prioritizing action. So there's actually a great quote from Nancy Pelosi in passing the Affordable Care Act where she says, I don't want to mess it up, so I've got it in front of me. It says, if the gates close, we'll go over the fence. If the fence is too high, we'll pole vault in. If that doesn't work, we'll parachute. We're going to get health care done. And that's the point that I'm finding here. And when we're trying to overcome legislative inertia, the point is action, doing something. And so we're prioritizing through these strategies political feasibility, the likelihood of doing something, instead of policy efficiency, actually addressing and solving policy problems. And so there are trade-offs to these strategies.
Getting something rather than
getting something
rather than getting the perfect thing.
rather than getting the perfect thing. And so this initial policy action often is just sort of like putting a Band-Aid on it. It might stop the bleeding for a bit, but if it's something that's really serious, and often it is, it's not going to resolve the underlying problem.
That certainly defines 1850.
Yes.
Does it define 1957?
In 1957, what we start to see is Lyndon Johnson has this mindset that the important thing here is that we show that we can act, and later on we can come back and we can take more substantive action. And so he is going to, with pressure from civil rights activists, he's going to come back and support the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after he inherits the presidency, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which for most of us that are in this room, or most people watching online, the extent that we know and understand the civil rights movement and the legislation it's produced, those are the ones we know, right? Those make more substantive contributions to actually protecting rights.
Yeah.
The Civil Rights Act of 1957, I didn't know about it until someone said, you should probably look at that. I said, okay. And so we might also see that we have some issues currently or in recent years where we've seen some of this long-term stalemate, where we might want to think about, well, how are we going to get action here? And so while I was here on fellowship in 2022, we actually saw the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act pass, which was the first gun reform legislation in over 30 years in Congress. And so this was after the Uvalde, Texas shootings, and as they were actually talking and then reading news articles about, well, here's how we're going to get something done, I'm thinking that this is exactly what I'm writing about.
Another
and
case
researching.
study. That's great.
And now that we've had the Dobbs decision, we might see this in regards to abortion legislation, not just in Congress, but that could also come up in state legislatures. There's no reason that we wouldn't expect this sort of theory to also be applicable to state legislatures if they're in a position where there's a topic that's at rest. Other things that we're seeing on the national level, Social Security reform has been talked about frequently, and we haven't seen major reform done there, and perhaps some efforts at combating climate change as well.
There's a lot ahead. Let's go to questions from the room or from online. Mike, where should we start? Okay, let's start online, and then please catch my eye, and I'll call on you for a question here from the room. Mike, online?
What did the final version of the Affordable Care Act show us in terms of who was most successful in using these negotiation strategies and which strategies worked best?
I mean, I think we see Nancy Pelosi pretty determined here, using these strategies to figure out what can actually be done at this time. And so we see her really driven through that quote that I just read off, where she's determined to get something. Even if it's not her ideal version, she's going to use these strategies to build a coalition. And so I think that's one area where we see it is with her. Harry Reid's pretty effective in it as well. You hear me mentioning Democratic leaders. I mean, these are the people that are compiling the bill. They're putting it together. And part of what's happening is that the president is taking a strategic approach, and that he's looking at how the Clinton healthcare bill failed in the 90s, and how the administration really tried to work on that on their own and come up with the best possible policy proposal and then sell it to the public. But what we see here is we see the Obama administration looking at some of the failings that the Clinton administration had with their plan and with their strategy, and they're trying to get the members of Congress that are starting to debate these bills and the different committees and come up with something that can make it to the floor and then get it to the floor. They're trying to get them invested in the process so that they're going to be just as determined. I don't think we get this bill without both strategic voting and dimension manipulation. Again, we have multiple instances of it here, and they're often tied together.
Next questions. Any other in the queue online, Mike?
Yeah, we have one.
Great.
Do you see long-term change in the way the types of negotiation you're talking about function between 2010, when increased polarization is already a concern, and now when polarization is widely considered to be at a crisis level?
Great question.
So can you say that one more time?
In 2010, polarization was already a thing
already
that people
bad.
were talking about, but in the 2020s, it's clear that it's reached a new
right.
level.
Yeah, so I mean, the best sort of correlation there would be looking at the 1850s and what comes after. And so we get the 1850s, people leave, the supporters of the Compromise of 1850 leave, and they say, we did it, we solved slavery forever. And then a decade later, we're in a civil war over slavery where it exists and the right for slavery to expand to the West, the exact same topics. Hopefully, we're not necessarily in that same situation now. We are seeing that polarization has gone up, but on the topic of healthcare, part of what we're seeing is the Affordable Care Act has become more accepted over time. And so on that particular issue, there still may be some attempts to find something that may be more effective. We saw the efforts to repeal and replace throughout the 2010s, but we also saw that those weren't as effective, in part because, because we start to see people liking some of the things that come out of that in terms of, well, we can't just go back to where we don't cover pre-existing conditions. We don't want to get rid of that age of 26 where dependents can stay on their parents' health care. So overall, I think we've seen a little less polarization on the issue of health care, even though we've seen more polarization and partisanship overall over the past decade.
Last thing I want to add, great, we have a question in the room here. And I see a microphone heading your way.
Thank you. Just a question about, I don't know, maybe the hopefulness of the idea that the crisis in legitimation leads to positive outcomes. And I'm just sort of trying to turn it the other way and think about other contexts that I'm familiar with where healthcare has been, where universal healthcare has been implemented. In New Zealand, it was 1935, similar legitimation crisis, the Depression. In the UK, it was after the Second World War. Nye Bevan said that he stuffed their mouths with gold. That's how he got the BMA to finally accept universal healthcare. Whereas here we're talking about 70 years later. Is there something that is too hopeful about assuming that a crisis in legitimation will kind of potentially lead to that? Because those crises have existed over and over and over again and haven't led here to something more like universal healthcare, whereas in other contexts they have. And maybe that friction might be something to do with, potential vested interests, the particular formation of the American legislative process. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, great question. So there is a degree to which we look at this and we say, well, you can look at some of these outcomes and say, are we better off without the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? We see instances, I mentioned for 82 years, we don't see civil rights legislation. It's not that the legitimacy crisis doesn't emerge on civil rights until 1957. It's present throughout there. There are multiple attempts to try to pass legislation and they fail. And there's no guarantee that it's going to work in 1957 either. So I think there's, to the degree that we're looking at this and saying, well, you can get legislative outcomes using these strategies, there's no guarantee that it will actually work. It almost didn't work in 1850 with the defeat of the Omnibus Bill. If not for Stephen Douglas and a guy who is like, I didn't mean to ruin Henry Clay's omnibus bill, I'm going to work with Stephen Douglas now, we may not get the Compromise of 1850. A guy makes a mistake, and he decides he wants to help Stephen Douglas fix that problem. And there's questions about these strategies and how they allow you to build a coalition, whether the effects that it has on policy content is actually worth it. Are you better off holding out for trying to get something that might make better policy? And that becomes sort of a judgment you have to make between, can we wait, or with the legitimacy crisis, is that going to get so bad first that we lose faith in the government and something different happens? When you're getting people to compromise, which is really what these strategies are helping to bring about, these are the strategies through which you get people to compromise and to live with changing their behavior and the way they vote, that may not necessarily resolve everything. And so I think that's something that we have to reflect on, and that's why I want to mention that in the takeaways too, is sure, we can get action, but are we satisfied with that action, not just in the short term, but in the long run? Because if we stop with the 1957 Civil Rights Act, there's not a whole lot great to say about it, right? You get a few things, but it's not going to resolve those tensions, and that's why we get that continued pressure from the civil rights movement to make more meaningful reforms. It's possible. There's no guarantee that we can get there and that we can take that more positive approach here to how these crises get resolved.
On all of these other issues that
Yes,
you've laid out.
yes.
Well, thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Alex Smith.